Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the Let's Talk Social Innovation podcast. I'm your host, Ian Kahinde, and this week I have a very special guest for y'all, Dr. Kyaien Conner. Say what's up.
What's up, everybody?
So, I was thinking about how I was going to introduce you to our audience, and you're a very accomplished individual. You have many titles, you go by a lot of different names. So, how do you want everybody listening and watching today to know you as?
Well, thank you for that opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kyaien Conner, but I typically go by Dr. K, affectionately by my students. I serve a number of roles here at the University of Pittsburgh as the incoming director of the Center on Race and Social Problems. I'm also a full professor and Donald M. Henderson Endowed Chair in the School of Social Work. And I'm also the Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the School of Social Work. So
that's like a whole alphabet list of titles.
That's a lot.
Crazy. But with introductions out of the way, let's get into what makes you you. Take me from the beginning of your upbringing.
So I had a really beautiful family dynamic and structure. My father, Marvin O'Quinn, is probably the biggest role model in my life. He grew up in a one-room shack in Tennessee, didn't have much, finished out his childhood in South Central Los Angeles, in Compton. Probably most people would look at this young Black man living in the hood and think he might not be able to make something of himself. And he certainly showed everyone that they were wrong. He put himself through undergrad at UCLA, and then he put himself through a master's program at the University of Washington in Seattle, which is where he met my mom, and they fell in love. And my mother was a nurse. And my dad is a hospital administrator and has run multiple hospitals across the country. Because of that, we moved around quite a bit. So I was born in Seattle, Washington, and then we were living in California and Oregon, New Jersey. Then they moved to Miami. And eventually I came to college actually here at the University of Pittsburgh. So I've lived in Pittsburgh longer than I've lived anywhere else at any point in time in my life.
That is crazy.
Just going to school. But I loved it here. Being at the University of Pittsburgh really shaped the directions of my future in my career. Coming to the University of Pittsburgh was an accident on purpose kind of thing. I didn't know much about this university before I got here. And now I can't imagine having made any other choice for the pathway for my career. Having the loving support of my family was great. That also sort of set me on a path towards healthcare. So as I mentioned, my dad runs hospitals. My mother is a nurse. My brother is a hospital consultant. His wife is a medical doctor. So I always knew that I was going to do some form of healthcare. I just didn't always know exactly what that was going to be. I always knew that I wanted to help people. And pretty early, I actually got interested in mental health. And some of that was because of my own experiences. Moving around a lot can be very anxiety provoking. And I was seeing some of that in my own family, but especially in my brother. My middle brother, who was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder when he was younger, but also likely struggled with some other more significant mental health challenges, including obsessive compulsive disorder and some depression. And as a young Black man, it was very difficult for my family to find culturally sensitive, meaningful treatment for him. Often they were pushing medication on him, even at a very, very young age. You could see the impact that those medications were having on him. He wasn't himself when he was taking them. And it impacted his growth and development throughout the course of his young years. As his older sister, I saw that, I watched that. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to be able to help people in my community who are struggling with mental health challenges. And I want to be able to think more holistically about what health care can look like, what treatment can look like beyond just a pill that you take.
Mhm.
And so it was really that inspired me to come to the University of Pittsburgh, to at the time come here as pre-med, thought I was going to go into psychiatry, ultimately ended up as a clinical social worker, and have spent my entire adult life really dedicated to the help and care of other people, and in particular, the Black community.
So at the beginning, what you were saying, you were telling me that you came to Pitt by accident. How does that happen? Like, walk me through that.
Actually, well, I had no frame of reference for the University of Pittsburgh. My father, because of his position in healthcare and medicine, suggested I apply to the
Mhm.
University of Pittsburgh. It was not even on my list of places I wanted or had any, thought of about coming to, because I had never even heard of Pittsburgh
Mhm.
before. And so he suggested just submit the application. We'll see what happens. And of course, I got accepted and they gave me a pretty nice scholarship. So at that point, my dad said, well, we should at least go and check it out and see if you like it. And I still, up to that moment, was sure I wasn't coming here. I was sure I was going to Spelman in Atlanta.
Mhm.
And then I came here. And that's why I say accident on purpose. Like I didn't really even want to apply. And then when I got here, it was an immediate wow moment for me. I was so impressed with the urban setting of the University of Pittsburgh, how you're kind of in the city, surrounded by people and minds from all over the world. I was excited by the opportunities that existed at this institution. Really, really excited about some of the specific programming that they had created for people of color and underrepresented groups. So when I got accepted to Pitt, I also got accepted into a program that was developed, a pre-medical program for Black students. There existed another one actually for engineering students of color as well, but it actually brought us to the University of Pittsburgh in the summer before freshman year started, so that we could network, create a bit of a support group with one another, and also take some courses over the summer to help us get started on the right foot, in an effort to increase retention and opportunities for students of color, which can be a challenge. So it was those kinds of programs, that sort of intentionality around diversity and representation and wanting us to feel included in an environment at a PWI where we might not immediately find community. They helped us to create one before we even started our, day one of our freshman year. That was meaningful to
Mhm.
me, and something that the other programs I got accepted to had not done. So it was things like that that really tipped the scale for me. And so now, I can't imagine not having come to the University of Pittsburgh. And of course, my father loves to rub it in my face that it's because of him and his suggestion that I even applied.
Dad's gotta take. They gotta take the. What word am I thinking of? They gotta take the credit for everything. You
Yes.
already know.
Thanks, Dad.
See, it's funny that you talk about the connections that you made, like in the Black community here, because that's one of the things that I'm seeing as a student here too. What a lot of people say is we have our own little HBCU at this PWI, and it's
Mhm.
like the Black community is like so like tight knit, and it's like everybody knows everybody. We don't leave anybody out. Nobody's alone, and that's something I
Yeah.
do really like about that.
That's so important. I mean, it can be very easy to get overwhelmed in a predominantly white institution, especially one of this size.
Mm.
I think that sometimes even our, you know, university administrators and leaders don't understand that young people come to college, of course, primarily for a good education, but also the cultural environment of those 4 years that they're going to spend of their young adult lives are so important.
They're
And
formative.
they're absolutely. And I think for a lot of students of color, some of the ones that have a difficult time, being able to make it and graduate, a lot of that has to do with that lack of support network, that lack of community, especially if you've come from a place where you've been receiving that support, to then move to a new city where you don't know anyone, where you don't know where places are, you don't know where those safe spaces are. It can feel very overwhelming. And the other reason why I think this is really connected to mental health, is the predominant number of serious and persistent mental health conditions that we see, many of them really begin to resonate themselves in young adulthood. And so that time period when young people are in college, that's actually when we really start to see a lot of signs and symptoms of debilitating mental health conditions and concerns. That coupled with the additional stress and anxiety of being in an institute of higher learning, that coupled with the additional anxiety and stress of not having your normal supports around you, maybe not having access to some of the people, places, or things that were coping strategies for you where you came from, that can be incredibly difficult. So really being able to support the holistic mental health and wellness of of young people in college is critically important, and in particular for those students who come from marginalized communities or backgrounds where they may not have as many, visible, explicit supports on campus. Creating that for yourselves is a beautiful thing. So I'm glad to hear that you guys are still doing that on campus, because we did the same kinds of things when I was a student here back in 1998.
So, getting into the field of researching healthcare, I know that you said that seeing your brother growing up was a big contributor to getting you into that field, but was there anything else that you could attribute to pushing you onto that path?
That's a great question, because the truth is, what happened with my brother, which is again a story that we hear very commonly in many families, that really pushed me to want to be a clinician. I actually didn't have an interest in being a researcher until much later, until I was actually exposed to it. So I got my master's in social work. I got licensed. I started working as a clinician in the community, and I had a number of different mental health related kinds of positions. I worked in community based mental health. I worked in some residential treatment facilities for adolescents who were dealing with mental illness, as well as some juvenile justice involvement. I also worked for a while in private practice. So I had a variety of different kinds of experiences as a clinician, really being able to help individuals, couples, families deal with the challenges that they were facing in their lives. And that was incredibly rewarding work for me. But there were a number of things that I was seeing and experiencing as a clinician, that led me to wonder if there was some way that I could be better serving my community, that I could be making a greater impact. A few examples. In my practice, I would hear other clinicians saying things like, that there's a Black family or a Black client who was coming for therapy, and then they had one session and never came back to another session again.
Mm.
That's not an uncommon thing. And actually, retention of clients of color is a really significant issue. And it sort of got me wondering, well, what's happening with these clients? We have treatments that work, but they're not going to work if we can't keep people engaged in services. So what could we be doing differently to better engage clients of color, to make them feel safe and like the treatment is meaningful for them? Which also led me to see other interesting things with treatments. So, we've got these evidence-based treatments, these interventions that have been well studied, well researched, that we know work. Sometimes following that very rigid approach doesn't work for all clients. And so I was starting to, I don't want to use the word experiment, but I was starting to play around with the notion of adding different kinds of approaches to my treatments, in particular with my clients of color. So for example, if I had a African American client who was very, very religious or spiritual, how can I integrate praying as a coping strategy? How can I integrate spiritual songs into the anxiety tools that I'm using? Because I know that's what works for that person. And I wasn't getting a lot of, effective training from my supervisors around how to do that effectively. I was seeing a lot of clients who were dealing with race-based trauma, who were dealing with symptoms that are very reminiscent to post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, right? Anxiety, fear, hypervigilance, not being able to sleep at night, high arousal, sometimes not because of violence perpetrated on them directly, but things that they were seeing in their community, things that they were seeing on social media. Um, and I will speak for myself as a clinician. I wasn't formally trained on how to assess race-based trauma, nor was I trained on how to treat it. So I was starting to look for and search for those kind of tools on my own, and a lot of that information did not exist. So I began to ask questions. I began to say, how can we better serve the needs of communities of color? How can we better engage them in treatment? How can we better retain them in treatment? How can we adapt our evidence-based interventions to be more culturally meaningful for the groups that we're working with? How can our diagnostic tools be more culturally sensitive to recognize that all groups of people don't present the symptoms of mental illness the same way? So we are misdiagnosing people because we don't understand that depression in Black men may not show up as them crying and not being able to get out of bed in the morning. Maybe it shows up as them drinking to cope and being irritable and being angry and ending up in prison because they haven't dealt with a mental health issue that could have been addressed in the community, but none of us even knew it existed. So it was those, and I didn't know what to do with these questions. I just had them. And it was actually Dean Larry Davis, who was the inaugural director and founder of the Center on Race and Social Problems, who was also the dean of the School of Social Work at the time I was a student there. And he was a great mentor of mine. I would talk to him about these questions. And again, still thinking I just wanted to be a therapist. And it was actually he who said, you have really important questions to ask. Who better than you to be the one to ask them and to find the solutions to these social problems? You should get a PhD and be a researcher. And up until that point in time, that thought had never even crossed my mind. I never saw myself in that light. But I started to talk to other researchers of color. I started to attend the renowned speaker series that the Center on Race and Social Problems was running, where they were bringing in these very high-level researchers and scholars of color from across the globe to come in and talk about critical issues, talk about their research. I was fascinated and I was inspired by it. So it was that really led to me applying to the doctoral program, which I was accepted to. So I got my PhD in social work. While I worked on my PhD in social work, I also worked on a second master's degree in public health with a specialization in minority health and health disparities so that I could better understand the more macro system level, community level factors that were also impacting upon the individuals, families, couples, and communities that I was going to be working with so that I could think more robustly about the kind of interventions and work that I was going to do, which was fantastic. So that's how I ended up here.
I think it's really cool how your research is directly fighting against the cookie cutter approach that the healthcare system takes, where it's like, I guess it's a one size fits all thing when everybody's unique in their own right. And like you were saying, we all present different symptoms differently.
Yeah.
And we need a more personalized approach to help us get better,
Absolutely.
Now, my question is, I guess, leading up to where you are now, when you were getting your PhD and your master's, what was it like going past undergrad into graduate school and higher education?
It was scary. It was scary. I think there were times where I questioned myself, second guessed myself. There certainly were less students of color as I was going higher up in my education. So, the same sort of support network that I felt in undergrad didn't exist in some of the higher education programs. So there were certainly times where that felt a little isolating, and I would have to do a little bit more work to find my community. Part of that community really became my mentors. I had amazing research mentors through my master's and doctoral program. Dr. Charlotte Brown, I will call her out, Dr. Valerie Carr Copeland. These were Black women who had my back, front, and all around. Really stepped in to support me during times where I was worried that I didn't have what it would take to make it, or worried about if I was smart enough to do this kind of work. Um, they were there to help lift me up when things got overwhelming, and really served a huge role in my success, brought me onto research projects, invited me to participate in papers so that I could get published. There were all these metrics of success at the doctoral level that are very different from what I was doing as an undergrad or even a master's level student. I had to relearn a lot. I had to relearn how to write for publications. I had to write scientifically. And I was getting a lot of feedback about the fact that I write the way that I speak, and I had too much of an informal tone. And part of that comes from just who I am in the community. I tend to want to relate to people. And I had to learn how to adjust that.
Now, hearing that you wrote too informally,
Yeah.
I feel like that sounds like a continuation of white supremacy culture in academia,
Mm-hmm.
because they want you to write and speak the way that they do, and they don't want you to be yourself.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think it's a difficult balance to try to strike, where there is a need for scientific writing to align with the discipline and the profession within which you're writing for, so that the audience can understand, take, and receive the information appropriately. But I also, as you mentioned, don't think that these same professionals disciplines are willing to recognize the flexibility and the way that different people, cultures, groups express themselves, and that does not mean that that way of writing is any less valid than this other style, right? And I've worked really hard to strike that balance where my writing still comes across concise and scientific, that it is applicable to the discipline that I am writing towards, that I sound professional, but also that you can get a bit of my personality through my writing, because that's very important to me. But it was hard being able to find a way to strike that balance in a way that made me feel like I was being true to myself, but also so that I could move forward in my career and not be, feeling like I was having to defend myself all of the time or justify the way that I was writing, the way that I was speaking, justify how I was presenting myself into the room and into a space. As I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with that. But I will say, as a student, learning, growing, wanting to be respected as a professional, I did often code switch, and I did often be very conscious of how I looked, how I did my hair, what I was wearing, because I was concerned about the way others would receive me. Now that I'm in a different season of my life, I bring my whole authentic self with me everywhere I go. And I really hope that I'm able to mentor younger people that are coming through the pathways like I was, to be more authentic with who they are, and to feel comfortable being who they are and being themselves, and recognizing that that is a strength, and the creativity, the art, all of those things that are also a part of who we are can be brought to bear and make us better researchers, better academics, better scholars, better teachers and professors and mentors. And sometimes I wish I had had someone that was able to say that to me when I was younger.
So, as a Black woman who's gone through the rigors of academia, what advice can you give to anybody who's trying to get on that track, or trying to, I guess, climb the corporate ladder and
Yeah.
how to present themselves?
I've got a few. One thing, and this is an interesting story that really shaped my career. Um, and I hear many students talking about, there are many pathways to the ultimate success that you want to have. First of all, you have to figure out what success means to you, because that's a subjective term, and success does not mean the same thing to everyone, right? So, what does success look like for you? Um, and then the pathway to get you there. But sometimes I think people worry that there's only one path to that outcome, and actually, there are many. The story for me is that when I finished my undergraduate degrees, I decided that I thought I was wanting to go into psychology, and I applied for a number of master's and dual master's PhD psych programs, clinical psych, and I didn't get into a single one of those programs.
Mm.
I was devastated. I couldn't figure out why. I had great grades. I had really high GRE scores. I couldn't understand why not a single one of these programs was interested in me. After having some meetings with my psychology professors, and I was going through my personal statement with them, I could see where there were some challenges. I had a very, very heavy social justice lens to my work. Even for psychology, all the work I was talking about, all the research I was interested in was very much applied and really focused on equity and injustice in communities of color. So my psychology professors were saying this might have been a bit much for some of the programs. It might not have been the right fit. And so just because you didn't get accepted, it didn't mean that there was anything wrong with you, but just that program wasn't going to be the best fit for the kind of things you want to do. And that was when I got introduced to social work. I had no idea what social work was. At the time, if I'm honest, I thought, oh, social work are the people that come and take kids out of people's homes when and they do, but social work as a field is way more broad and robust than that. It's a beautiful, amazing discipline, and actually are the number one providers of clinical mental health services of all the other professions. They have a direct practice route where you can learn how to be a therapist and do individual counseling, but they also have a COSA route where you can learn about community organizing and advocacy and how to run a social service organization and be the director of social service organizations. They have a huge social justice focus and lens. I didn't know any of that existed.
I didn't know it existed.
Right?
Either.
So I went to the School of Social Work and I said, hey, this is me. This is what I'm interested in doing. Here's my application. They accepted me immediately and gave me a full scholarship to get my master's. They also then accepted me into the doctoral program, the joint MPH program, and, gave me a monthly stipend as well. So, ultimately I do that. I get my PhDs. I do a postdoc at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic. I get a big grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to study barriers to service utilization for older adults of color. And then I become an assistant professor of psychiatry. So this whole pathway ended up exactly where I wanted to be, on a path that I never even could have seen for myself, with doors opening to places that I never could have envisioned. And so the advice that I often give to young people is that your journey, the process is important. And I know it sounds cliche, but it's true. When one door closes, there's another bigger, better, more amazing door that's yours, that's opened for you. And to use those setbacks as opportunities to find a better opportunity for you. If I had just let that situation deter me from moving forward, not getting into one of those programs, if I had let, that mean something about my worth, I might not have ended up where I am right now. So be persistent, be gritty, be resilient. That's a part of who we are as a people anyway. Don't let no's, mean
Define you.
yes, absolutely, because there's a lot of amazing things that are out there for you. Be open to them and surround yourself with a support network that is doing positive things, that are going to be there to support you during those rough times, and that also are going to uplift you and cheer you on through the course and through the process.
That is a lot of wisdom that's just been passed down to me. I feel very, very honored to hear this.
Oh, thanks.
But this is a good time to get into this week's artist spotlight. We're going to be playing the song My Friend from 957, and I hope y'all enjoy. Hope you enjoyed listening to My Friend by 957. You'll find their Spotify and their YouTube pages linked in the description if you want to hear more music from them. But we're going to be getting into the second half of today's discussion, and we're going to be talking about disparities with physical and mental health in the Black community. So I leave it open to you, Dr. Conner.
Yeah. So, I think I was sort of talking earlier about some of my experiences in mental health treatment, where I was seeing challenges with retention and engagement of communities of color in mental health services. So that was sort of a starting point for me wanting to learn more about what kind of disparities actually existed. I learned a lot more about this in my master's in public health program, where I focused on minority health and health disparities. And when we're talking about disparities, we're talking about differences in health, and those could be health outcomes, that could be access to health. There's a range of different areas of health where we can see disparities, right, in the incidence or prevalence of disease. Like what percentage of a population or a community experiences a disease. Maybe it's also in things like mortality or morbidity, adjusted age ranges for when someone is how long someone is likely to live, or how disabling a condition is likely to be, and a whole bunch of other factors in between. And as I began to learn more about disparities, one of the things that we talk about is that certainly there are differences in almost every health issue or condition between different groups. So we're not just talking about health differences. We're talking about differences that are likely the result of unfair and disadvantaged treatment in society. We're talking about differences that are not that don't need to be there, differences that could be addressed, differences that are not due to genetics or due to biology, but due to justice issues, equity issues, access to care issues, quality of care issues, that are leading certain groups to experience greater disadvantage than other groups. For no reason that can be concretely tied to something that we can't do something about.
So I guess a question that I have from that is, how does a lack of health care show itself in a group?
Yeah, in many, many ways. And of course, we know that groups that lack health care tend to be low income, tend to be immigrant populations, and tend to be communities of color. When you don't have access to services, you're less likely then to get preventative treatments. So in medicine and in healthcare, a lot of our work has been sort of this helping people after a sickness already develops, right? You're sick, you go to the doctor. You break your ankle, you go to the emergency room. Something bad happens, you get treatment.
I think that even part of that is that a lot of us are very scared to get treatment in the first place because of how big the bills are.
Oh, absolutely. So can you imagine someone who does not have insurance and what's going to, and they're the kind of immediate barriers that are placed there to going and trying to get care on one's own. Individuals and communities where they are having to make real choices about whether or not they can afford to pay for healthcare, or are they going to pay for food to put on their family's table tonight. These are real decisions that people are making. There are, for that same reason, I have friends who don't have health insurance, who haven't been to see a dentist in 10 years. And for many people, they may think, oh, it's just your teeth, but actually dental health and dental hygiene has a significant impact on other physical health outcomes as well. Mental health, physical health, and all of our healthcare systems are intrinsically connected. And so oftentimes things, even in our mouth, that are happening can impact us, our health, mental health function, as well as our physical health function. So yeah, if there are issues with access to care, you're less likely to engage in preventative care services that can ward off issues from becoming a problem. You're less likely to go in for treatment, even if there is an issue. And so this can sometimes show itself as people landing in the emergency room for emergency care for issues that have been lingering for sometimes years, that could have been treated and addressed effectively in the community-based setting or in primary care, that now has become crisis. And now someone's in the emergency room when something is already pretty severe or significant. It lends itself to individuals not being able to afford mental health services, right? We may go see our primary care physician once a year. Maybe you deal with the copay for that. But mental health services can sometimes be expensive. And for many people who don't have ready access to that, or don't have that opportunity for services through their employer, being able to pay for services every week seems like an expense that many families don't feel like they can afford. So, and it's not just the actual physical access to care. There's also an issue of access to culturally sensitive care, access to quality care. There's been a great deal of research that has showed that individuals who are from disenfranchised communities and racial and ethnic minority backgrounds are less likely to get quality healthcare services in comparison to other groups when they go for services or treatment. That can show up as doctors being less likely to explain what is happening. For whatever reason. And sometimes we could go into a whole other conversation about if that's intentional or if that's a remnant of implicit bias, but just not being as collaborative, even in the process of thinking about treatment planning, letting the patient have more of a say in the planning out of their own health or health care.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talked down to all the time, it's not like you're going to want to go back into that doctor.
Absolutely. So that's the other challenge. So if earlier we were talking, I was mentioning that there were a number of clients who would come into our practice and have one session with the clinician and not come back. I was trying to better understand why. I ended up actually doing some research, following up with some of those clients as a part of my doctoral study to try to better understand why they weren't being retained in services. And many of them talked about actually feeling microaggressed by their therapist.
That's crazy.
And so, and these are, so one of the things I think is interesting, and I know this could be going on a tangent, but I think it's important. I often hear this statement from clinician friends of mine, this statement about color blindness, this statement about, I don't see color. I just see you as a person and we're all human beings, and I don't even see you as a Black person, right?
We all have implicit bias.
Yes. And I know that for many of those clinicians, that statement comes from a good place, for many of them. I want to believe that, in a place of saying, I don't treat people differently based upon the color of their skin. But when you make statements like, I don't see color, that means you must not see me, because I
Mhm.
clearly have a color that impacts me every day when I walk out of the house, that I'm aware of all of the time, that impacts the sociocultural paradigm within which I live my life. It impacts how I see the world. It impacts how other people see me. And if you're not willing, as my therapist, to acknowledge that, then I don't feel comfortable continuing therapy
What
with
are
you.
we doing
What are we
here?
doing here? Right.
Yeah.
Right. So those clients didn't come back. That is an issue. That inability for effective cross-cultural communication, the fact that many of our healthcare providers are coming to the table with implicit bias and maybe unwilling to recognize it, or unwilling to deal with how it's actually having an impact on their patients. And so certainly that impacts whether or not someone feels comfortable going to get healthcare or treatment. So that even if someone has access to care, they still may not get it care. So, Obamacare and all these major policy initiatives to make sure that everyone has access to health insurance, to make sure that everyone has access to health care. Of course, I'm in support of these things. I think everyone should have access to services. And I might go so far as to say that I tend to be more in favor of a more socialist model, where I appreciate countries and systems where universal health care is a thing.
You don't
And
have to worry about bankrupting yourself to go get something checked out.
yeah, there are problems with those systems too, but politically I tend to align more with those kind of systems. But the point about that is that even if you were to even in England, where they have universal health care, there are still health disparities,
Mm.
and there are still access to care issues. So it's not just about making healthcare available. It's about making culturally relevant and meaning healthcare services that are in places and in communities that have access to it, with clinicians and treatment providers that are representative of the community that they're working in, so that people feel comfortable and safe, being able to get needed care in a timely fashion that is going to benefit them and their families.
So, through your research, what have you found are, I guess, some of the biggest factors that are keeping people from getting care? And how can we get people in the door?
That's a fantastic question. And there's a number of responses. So, when we look at barriers to service utilization, we can kind of put them in some general categories. So, there are physical barriers. So, these are things like transportation, hours of treatment availability. So, in communities, Pittsburgh is great in that it has a pretty well functioning public transport system.
Mm.
Not every city has access to that. I just came from the city of Tampa, where if you don't have a vehicle,
You can't get
you're not going
anywhere.
to be able to, right, you're not going to be able to get anywhere. So for many individuals who were having issues with access to care, it was literally about, I can't access care. I can't physically get there. And so creating support. The COVID pandemic brought us the opportunity for more virtual care, which I think has in some cases helped to address that issue. But this is still a critical problem, people being able to physically access care. For other kinds of care, a lot of our doctors, if they have appointments, it's generally during the 9 to 5 working day.
And when you can't, when you're struggling with bills, you can't just be
You
like, I gotta take off work to go take care of this. You can't do that, or you're not gonna be able to eat.
Right, right. So these are very practical kinds of barriers that could be addressed, but that sometimes I think in leaders and physicians and other healthcare providers aren't thinking about. They are quite literally creating barriers for their patients just by these sheer physical kinds of factors. But then there's also sort of psychological factors, the fear about talking to someone about what's going on with them, particularly when it comes to mental health. There are a lot of people, and in the Black community specifically, I think, who are concerned about sharing with someone else their innermost thoughts and secrets, things that they may wonder where this information is going to go. Is this something that could end up hurting me later? I don't feel comfortable telling someone that I may be thinking about killing myself. What will happen to my kids if I open up about that? That fear is a real barrier. There are also a lot of myths about mental health treatment in particular. I think that for many people, all they know about mental health treatment is what they see online or what they see in social media or they see on TV, which is a very Freudian, someone lays on the couch and someone sits behind them with a pen and paper and starts to read their dreams. There's a lot of newer, brief, collaborative approaches to mental health treatment. But if you were to ask someone what the different kinds of mental health services are, the average person wouldn't be able to tell you that. So just a lack of information really as well about different kinds of options that are available. And then there's the stigma around mental illness that's a really big deterrent and in many communities. And that stigma is really something that's been socially created. Historically, we have not treated people who were neurodivergent very well. There was a time in our history where we treated people who were suffering from mental health challenges just as bad, if not worse, than thieves and deviants, putting people in cages and treating them in very inhumane ways. Since then, as a society, I think we've worked really hard to try to recognize that a mental health condition should be viewed just the same as a physical health condition, and that we shouldn't stigmatize someone just for having issues with depression or anxiety or schizophrenia. Um, but that stigma still exists. And we do see in society, we still see in media, movies, really bad representations of mental illness. Whenever there's something violent that happens, or whenever there's a school shooting, our immediate inclination in the media is to try to, identify that this is a facet of that person having a severe and persistent mental illness, or this is a person who was not taking their appropriate psychiatric medication. And what's so frustrating about that is that in reality, people who are living with mental illness are more likely to be the victims of crime than they are to be the perpetrators of crime. But that's not the narrative that is out in the world.
I think the narrative that's being pushed, it's just crazy to me because these people are already at war within themselves,
Yeah.
but then they'll also be outwardly antagonized by the people around them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you could imagine then that someone who might be suffering or living with mental health symptoms that are impacting them on a daily basis would be afraid to identify with that label, afraid to, you know, outwardly say to themselves or anyone else that they may be suffering with these symptoms or living with this mental health condition, which in and of itself then delays them from wanting to go and get treatment or support or help. So again, seeing individuals in an emergency room in crisis for something that could have been effectively treated in the community, you know.
So then what can we do to get people in the door?
So there's a number of things, and there's been, some research that I've been doing around these issues that I think is really meaningful. One of the first research projects that I did as a doctoral student, that I've now since published, was looking at racial differences and attitudes towards seeking mental health treatment. And in part of gaining some of those attitudes and beliefs, some of which I just shared with you, I was also trying to identify possible solutions. What can we do? And there were a few things that kind of resonated from that to me. One of them was the importance of lay health workers. I call them peer educators in my project. But really, what I saw was the need for people to be able to talk to other people who had experienced what they're experiencing. someone who has not just the book smarts and knowledge, but the lived experience knowledge. Someone who can say, I've been there. And I actually do know some of what you're feeling. And here's my story. And here's how this treatment helped me. Someone that people feel like they can trust. So a lot of the research that I've been doing has been looking at how we can better utilize these lay health educators. These are people who don't necessarily have specialized training or master's degrees in counseling or mental health, but community members who want to give back, who want to make an impact in
They
their
act as a
own communities.
bridge.
They act as a absolutely. I see you got my first paper was about how late health educators can be a bridge to health services. So these are folks that we then train who are placed in their communities, who become valued resources in their own communities, building social capital, being able to connect with people who may feel uncomfortable going to the doctor or who may feel uncomfortable going to see a psychologist, but they can talk to someone who's in their community already, who has a little bit more knowledge than other people, who's been trained to provide some additional kinds of support, maybe motivational interviewing, maybe some psychoeducation, and then they can serve as a bridge for meaningful treatment for those who need additional supports and services, but then can connect people to culturally meaningful, culturally sensitive services that are going to be helpful and beneficial to them. And the people in the community are more likely to listen and believe them because they've got that trust in that key stakeholder that's there. So I've been using peer educators in a number of ways. I've also been trying to figure out how to adapt clinical interventions to be more culturally meaningful. And I've been doing that through the integration of cultural practices that we know, these ancestral practices that we know on the continent of Africa have always been part of our process for healing. But here in the United States are not really recognized as pathways for healing. And one of those is drumming. So I had a really cool project in Tampa that I would love to bring here to Pittsburgh, where we were looking at the impact of West African drumming on reduction of anxiety symptoms, reduction of depression, reduction of anger symptoms, and also improvements in memory and in cognition for adults who had early onset Alzheimer's disease. This was a really amazing project that we were doing inside local senior daycare centers. And to be able to see, we would sometimes walk into these centers and you would see, these elders who were not moving, not interacting with anyone, just kind of sitting to themselves and isolated. And then by the end of a drumming session, are smiling, are playing an instrument, are laughing, are feeling like they're able to make a connection. And for many of them who couldn't even verbalize their name, they could remember a rhythm that they learned a few weeks prior from session. So again, that was a very preliminary project that now I'd like to see if we can expand upon. And what are other kinds of culturally relevant ideas, beliefs, values, activities, these ancestral kinds of activities that have been meaningful as health tools for our people? How can we better integrate those into evidence-based treatment so that our community has access to an intervention that is meaningful to them on more than just one level? Drumming is one, West African dancing is another. Again, I talked earlier about religiosity and spirituality. Again, not everyone connects with that, but for people who do, that's an incredibly
Very
powerful, strong. Yes. And how can we integrate those kinds of coping strategies into therapy for people? That's one thing I often hear, which is important to mention. It's a big barrier in the Black community in particular, religion. And there are people who will say, I don't need to go to therapy.
I can pray it
I can
away.
pray it away. Yeah. And so it's tricky because on the one hand, as I mentioned, spirituality, prayer are huge coping mechanisms and they can be incredibly beneficial. But also, it doesn't have to be an either or. It can be both, right? You don't have, going to see a therapist does not mean that you don't believe in your faith in your relationship with God. My mentor, Dr. Charlotte Brown, and I, when we would go into different communities, we used to use the saying, if you walked outside the door right now into the street and you got hit by a car, you broke your leg, and you come back in here dragging your leg behind you, are you going to just sit here in the pew and pray to God about it? Or are you going to go to the hospital and get your leg fixed? You're going to go to the hospital and get your leg fixed. That's a no-brainer. So why don't we have that same attitude when there's something going wrong with our mind? Yeah. We should have the same thought process. And somewhere along the line, we've been told
there's just a disconnect.
Right. And that it's something that you should be able to handle on your own, and that you should be able to pray away, and that you should be able to deal with. And that kind of energy is completely not only unethical, but it's incorrect. Mm-hmm. It's incorrect. Most people who are living with some sort of a mental health condition or concern will need some sort of professional treatment or guidance to be able to work their way through it. And for that doesn't mean that's treatment in the form of a medication, or, that doesn't mean that for everyone. For many people, talk therapy is very, very effective. There are also somatic kinds of approaches that deal with other aspects of your physical body to help connect to changes in brain chemistry. There are a variety of different approaches that can be effective. For many people, it's physical activity, exercise, or mindfulness, yoga. All of these things can be incredibly beneficial for one's overall health and wellness. I would like to see us as a society get to a point where we can talk about these things more honestly, openly, and transparently without that stigma. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I talk to my colleagues and I'll say, even in a school where we are all educators and are all clinicians in the mental health field, how many of you would call in sick by saying you need a mental health day, or by saying your anxiety is flaring up and you need to go and see your psychiatrist? Would you be comfortable saying that? Or are you more likely to just say you have a cold, or you have a really bad migraine? Most of us are still more comfortable identifying a physical challenge than a mental health one. And until we can get to a place where those two things feel exactly the same, we still have work to do. And it will still continue to be a deterrent for our community to go and get help.
So as we're coming to the end of this episode, I think that one last thing that we can touch on is advice that you can give to people who have been wronged by the healthcare system and they feel like they're burned and they're scared to go back. What can you say to them?
Yeah. I will first say that I am deeply apologetic for people who go through those kind of situations. I've been through some with my own family, and it's hard. It can take an emotional toll. What I will tell people is that not everyone you encounter in the healthcare system is going to burn you, and it is important for us to prioritize our health. It is also important for you to find a clinician, whether that's a therapist for mental health, or a primary care physician for more of a physical health issue. You should be empowered to find a clinician that aligns with your values and beliefs. Sometimes I think that we expect that we should just deal with or accept whatever doctor has been assigned to us. We don't have to do that. The relationship between you and a clinician is incredibly important. And sometimes it may take a few different people to find someone that you really feel gets you, that you feel comfortable really talking to and being open and honest with, because you can tell that they genuinely care about your well-being and have some understanding and knowledge of your lived world and cultural context to be able to provide that support. And if you don't have that in the clinician or provider that you're working with, you don't need to stay with that clinician or provider. Please don't let one or two
bad eggs
exactly deter you from potentially seeking someone who can make a huge impact on the longevity of your life. prioritize your health, because it's the one thing that probably is more and the most important to all of us is our health.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation diving into the healthcare system. I very much appreciate you having this with us.
Thank you. Thank you for
Now,
having me.
my friend, Dr. Toya Jones, she
Ah,
just started a new podcast, Healing Overflow with Dr. Toy. It's a
yes.
social work podcast, and she wanted me to give this to you.
Oh,
Feel free to go through the contents whenever you'd like.
thank you.
But to our listeners, Healing Overflow with Dr. Toy, the first episode should be out now. They'll be dropping first and third Thursdays of each month. So I'll have a link to her channel in the description. I would highly recommend subscribing, as she can teach you a lot that you didn't even know about yourself. But before we sign off, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I think this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here and to talk about something that's really important and something that we should talk about a lot more in our community. So thank you for doing the work that you do and shining a light on critical issues.
Just to remind everybody, this is Dr. Kyaien Conner. I'm your host, Ian Kahende, and we are signing off.